And now, Legal Perspective with Ali Menegakis.
In the age of 24/7 headlines and TikTok takedowns, some trials play out more in the comment section than in the courtroom. But where's the line between informed reporting and trial by media? Joining us to break it all down is Ali Menegakis, attorney with Clekus Law Firm. Ali, great to have you back with us today. So media is a vital tool, right, for public transparency, but it kind of crosses, or it can cross that line with risk of prejudice and bias. We saw this in the Pamela Smart trial. I think that was the first one cited, 1991, from start to finish. The whole case was televised. Do you think trial by media has become more common because of social media, or do you think it's just more publicized?
I think it's definitely become more common, and with the rise of social media too, it's become more dangerous. I think, you know, we look at even the Diddy case that happened recently, and you see, you know, I had people as a criminal defense attorney, people would come up to me and say, oh, don't you think Diddy's guilty? Don't you think this is terrible what he did? And my response was, can you name 2 pieces of evidence that you think would convict him of the charges that he was charged with? And most people can't, but then they still have that feeling that he's guilty. Why is that? It's because the media will sensationalize, repeat this information and reporting to the extent that, you know, potential jury pools can get tainted, and then people are convicted by the court of public opinion. But you know, you look at that and you compare it to other cases. Someone, Diddy, who is very wealthy, had a whole PR team, had a huge legal defense team. And then you look at a local case, if y'all remember, the case of Timothy Taylor regarding the disappearance of the young girl from the Northeast, Brittany Drexel. Now, Timothy Taylor, the FBI came out in 2016 and said, and provided this very inflammatory accusations that Timothy Taylor had kidnapped, raped, and thrown Ms. Drexel's body into an alligator pit. Now, that information turned out to be completely false and non-credible. However, the media really picked up on that case. And Mr. Taylor was, you know, convicted by his peers and by the public, and he was never even charged. And so he couldn't even like protect himself and cross-examine witnesses in a trial. Now, 6 years later, in 2022, the FBI actually found this sex offender, Raymond Moody, who had actually committed that crime. Had nothing to do with Timothy Taylor, but his name and his reputation was, you know, irreparably harmed at that point.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. When the Tim Taylor, I heard all about this, you know, the convictions and the stuff I was hearing on the news, but then when they found the actual man who did it, I never saw a statement from any media forum saying, oh, you know, he's innocent, Tim Taylor's innocent, right?
And there were some, but certainly not as much and to the extent that it was covered back in 2016 and for years after that. And really, what is the recourse? You know, he is one of my clients, and we have filed civil litigation against the federal government for reputational harm and pain and suffering. But unfortunately, you know, the law is not really on his side. You know, the FBI, the courts can, the law enforcement can release the names of suspects, and then the media will run with it, but there doesn't necessarily have to be credible evidence. That's what the difference is between the court system and our due process system.
It's a very heartbreaking situation what Tim Taylor went through, and it was very interesting, you know, with Diddy, of course, you know, he was found not guilty of the big charges, but he's very wealthy, versus Tim Taylor. This is going to have much different effects long-term on his life. And can you speak to that briefly about, you know, how his life has changed since, even with the man being the actual perpetrator in 2022, how have things been for him these past 3 years?
Even since, you know, looking back from 2016 when he was accused of that, it has affected so much. He and his family received death threats to his home. They received terrible comments on social media and posts on media articles, things like that. He lost jobs. The family lost family and friends that didn't want to communicate with them. And even after Raymond Moody was found and convicted and confessed and led the FBI to the body of Brittany Drexel, people still think that he was somehow involved in it. And so even to this day, you know, he has been exonerated in the fact that he the real perpetrator came forward and was convicted, but the FBI has refused to apologize for it. In fact, they said they don't owe any apology, that they're allowed to do everything that they did. Most media outlets have not corrected that or apologized, though some have. He's never going to be able to get back to the person he was before this all happened. His name will forever be associated with Brittany Drexel.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have to take a short break, but we're going to be right back to continue our conversation with Allie in 2 minutes. Back after this. Welcome back, Allie. Thanks for being here with us again. We briefly talked about the Tim Taylor case. There's so much more to unpack with that. But in a case with pretrial publicity, how does that impact the jury selection process?
It's huge. You have, under the Sixth Amendment, a right to an impartial jury of your peers, right? Impartial means someone that hasn't been prejudiced by information that would make them sway one way or another. So if you think about, the Diddy case, or in the case, Timothy Taylor was never charged, but in the Diddy case, there was all this information that came out, and it was international news. There wasn't probably a soul that hadn't heard about those cases, and definitely those jurors that were selected had certainly heard about the Diddy case. It would be impossible not to do that. So there's certain safeguards that the court system that we have in law to try and prevent from prejudice in terms of the juries and making sure they're impartial. One of them is a change of venue, meaning that you can, as a defense attorney, you can make a motion, or a prosecution, you can make a motion to move the trial to a different court system or different jurisdiction or different county. Obviously, in a case that big, doesn't matter where you go, they're going to hear about it. So what other safeguards are there? Well, there's the jury selection process, also called voir dire. And the point of that process is to actually talk to those jurors and find out what information they have heard about a case, how they feel about it, and then the ultimate question is, do you think that that would prejudice you in this case to rule one way or another, then guilty or not guilty? And so when that happens, the lawyers usually have an opportunity to really go into deep questions about, in the federal courts and in most state courts, they get to ask these jurors questions and dive into not just one or two questions about it, but really get to the feeling behind those jurors and how they feel about the case. Interestingly, in South Carolina, we do not have attorney-led voir dire. We do not have attorneys that have the opportunity to ask questions to the jurors. It's only the judge that gets to do it. And so you get to submit questions, and a lot of those are not allowed in, and you really lose the opportunity to find out if a juror is going to be impartial or partial.
What would be the reason for South Carolina to not allow attorneys to do that? Because I feel like, just thinking about it, that makes sense, more sense than a judge doing it. Is there a reason?
I just think that we have not got to that point yet. And that's one of the things that we fight for as criminal defense attorneys through my nonprofit, South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reforms. That's one of the big things that I think needs to change in this state to make sure that everyone gets a fair trial.
Do you think that this type of coverage can ever be helpful, or is it inherently dangerous?
I think it's vital to have coverage of important cases, whether they're smaller level or larger level. That's what the great thing about our country is in the First Amendment and the free press. We want our press to be able to report and give us information. We want the press to find out information and question where it's coming from, to give us full transparency with our government. You look at a case like Diddy, and then you compare that to a person like Timothy Taylor, right? And in the Timothy Taylor case, you have the FBI recklessly releasing these false accusations that were never verified, turned out to be false, not taking accountability for that, not apologizing, and someone's life irreparably harmed, a young black man from a poor community. The most concerning thing that I see in the practice of law, whether it's criminal defense, personal injury, is the double standards that exist to this day. The great thing about our country and the Equal Protection Clause is that everyone should be treated equally, not just by the courts, but also by the media, right? But we don't see that, unfortunately. People are convicted by the court of public opinion before they even get into the court process.
And I do want to ask you really quick before we go to break, Is there anywhere that people can go or that you'd recommend if someone wants hard facts, hard true facts, not on social media? Is there a forum people can go to if they want information about the case? What would you recommend, if anything?
You know, I think that it really comes down to what are facts before a case goes to trial, right? Because there might be evidence, for example, the case of Timothy Taylor. They released a fact that turned out not to be true, right? This statement, this hearsay statement from a jailhouse informant. You can get that information from police reports. So when you're on the, the internet or wherever you're looking, I would go to the actual reports, make sure that they're verified, and you can see what the accusations are. But the important thing to remember is that these are just accusations that haven't been authenticated. They haven't been admitted into evidence, and that's where the court system is. So if you want the real truth and the stuff that is fair and not prejudiced, then you want to look at those trials that you can watch on TV. But keep in mind, the stuff that you see on TV is not everything that the jury sees. When they have those bench trial conferences, the jurors don't get to see that, but the public does.
So be conscious, be critical, and question everything. For any of your legal concerns, 843-9000000, clegus.com is where you can go. Allie, thank you so much. We're excited to have you back next week to talk about something very interesting. We're back in 2 minutes.
This has been Legal Perspective with Allie Menegakis.